Differences between verbal communication and non-verbal communication. Verbal communication versus non-verbal communication. The communication in which the sender uses words to transmit the message to the receiver is known as verbal communication, whereas the communication that takes place between sender and receiver with the use of signs is known as non-verbal communication. Types of verbal communication are formal and informal, whereas types of non-verbal communication are chronemics, vocalics, haptics, kinesics, proxemics, and artifacts. There is no time-consuming in verbal communication, whereas there is time-consuming in verbal communication. Chances of transmission of wrong message rarely happens in verbal communication, whereas chances of transmission of wrong message happens most of the time in non-verbal communication. There is documentary evidence in verbal communication, in case of written communication, whereas there is no documentary evidence in non-verbal communication. The message can be clearly understood and immediate feedback is possible is the advantage of verbal communication, whereas helpful in understanding emotions, status, lifestyle and feelings of the sender the advantage of non-verbal communication. In verbal communication, the message can be transmitted through letters, phone calls, etc., so the personal presence of parties doesn't make any change. Whereas in non-verbal communication, the personal presence of both the parties to communication is a must. Medium of communication in verbal communication uses language, words, sentences, and voice as the medium of communication, whereas medium of communication in non-verbal communication uses body language, facial expressions, tone, and pauses in speech as the medium of communication. Channels of communication. Verbal communication uses a single channel of communication, the human voice, which speaks a single word at a time. Non-verbal communication uses multiple channels of communication including your entire body, facial expressions, and tone of voice. Examples of communication. Verbal communication can take place over a phone call, in a face-to-face conversation, over loudspeakers, through audio recordings, and so on. Non-verbal communication can only occur when all the parties in the conversation can see each other. This helps them properly understand what they are communicating non-verbally. Consciousness in communication. Verbal communication is a conscious process. It involves thinking, processing, and articulating. Non-verbal communication happens on an unconscious level. One doesn't really think about it actively. Mode of communication in verbal communication is linear and voluntary. You set out to say something, gather your thoughts, form your sentences, and then start delivering your message. It is a well-thought-out process in which the speaker focuses on communicating their message effectively. Whereas mode of communication in non-verbal communication is a continuous process. It is not well thought out and is largely involuntary, although you can train yourself to use it more purposefully. Unlike verbal communication, non-verbal communication is not linear. It depends more on how one uses their body language and other cues to respond to external stimuli. Decoding the communication in verbal communication is fairly easy to decode if you understand the language and the words being used. When you pay close attention to the person who is speaking, you will understand what they are saying. Whereas decoding the communication in non-verbal communication is a little harder to decode than verbal communication. You have to pay attention to many factors including the speaker's body language, facial expressions, and tone to decode what the other person is trying to convey. Kindly subscribe my YouTube channel Thesis Helper. Thanks for watching.